The day Eudora Merritt walked into the Marshal's office with dried mud on her boots and grief still raw in her eyes, the whole town of Caldwell, Kansas held its breath without knowing it. It was the autumn of 1882, and Caldwell sat at the edge of the Kisham Trail like a bead strung on a worn leather cord, dusty and loud, and full of men who believed the law was mostly a suggestion. The cattle drives had slowed with the season, but the saloons were still full, and the jail was never empty for long. The wind off the plains carried the smell of horses and wood smoke, and something wilder underneath, something that reminded every person who lived there that civilization was still a thin and fragile thing out on the Kansas frontier. Eudora was 27 years old, with brown hair the color of turned earth and eyes the pale gray of a sky before a storm. She was not a fragile woman. She had homesteaded with her husband Thomas for 3 years before a fever took him in January, leaving her alone with 40 acres of winter-hard land, a half-finished barn, and a son named Caleb who was 6 years old and already learning not to cry too much because his mother needed him steady. She had planted and harvested and mended and cooked and done every single thing that needed doing on that land, and she had done it alone. And she had done it without asking a single person in Caldwell for anything. But the Decker brothers had given her no choice. Wade Decker and his younger brother Roy had been riding the edge of her property for 2 weeks, cutting her fence lines, letting their cattle trample her winter wheat, and leaving notes stuck to her door with a hunting knife. The notes said the same thing in different arrangements of the same ugly words. "Get out. This land belongs to us. You have no business here without a man to hold it." The last note had included a drawing of a noose. Eudora had taken that note to the Marshal. Marshal Clarence Hooper was a broad man who had grown broad in all the wrong ways over his 12 years in office, his gut pushing against his belt, his face red and fleshy under a hat that had seen better decades. He sat behind his desk when Eudora came in, and he did not stand, which told her everything she needed to know about how seriously he intended to take her. She laid the note on his desk and she told him everything. She told him about the fences, about the cattle, about the wheat that had been trampled to nothing, about the 2 weeks of harassment and fear. She kept her voice level. She kept her hands still. She had practiced this in the mirror that morning because she knew that a woman who cried in a marshal's office was a woman who got patted on the shoulder and sent home, and she needed more than that. Marshal Hooper looked at the note. He looked at it for a long time, which at first seemed promising until she realized he was not reading it so much as deciding what to say to make her leave the fastest. "Mrs. Merritt," he said, and he leaned back in his chair and laced his fingers over his stomach. "The Decker family has been in this county longer than most of the buildings standing in this town. Wade Decker's father drove cattle up this trail before you were born, and Wade himself has more grazing rights filed with this county than any other operation in the territory." "I have a deed," Eudora said. "A legal deed registered in Wichita for 40 acres. The Deckers have no claim on my land." "That may be," Hooper said, "but a note on a door isn't a crime I can take to a judge, and cutting a fence is a civil matter, not a criminal one. What you're describing is a neighbor dispute, Mrs. Merritt, and I am not in the business of settling neighbor disputes." "He drew a noose on that paper," she said quietly. Hooper glanced at the note again. "Could be a lot of things, could be nothing." "It is a threat against my life." "Now, I don't know that," Hooper said, and there was something in his voice that told her he did know that he knew exactly what it was, and that he had already decided it was not his problem. "My advice to you, and I say this with all due respect to your situation, is to consider whether that piece of land is worth the trouble. A woman alone out there with a young child. There are folks in town who take the property off your hands at a fair price, give you enough to start somewhere else, somewhere more. I am not selling my land," Eudora said. "Then I'm afraid there's not much I can do for you," Hooper said, and he slid the note back across the desk toward her. She stared at him. She had known this might happen, had steeled herself for it, but the reality of it was still a cold and miserable thing settling in her chest. She picked up the note and she folded it and she put it in the pocket of her coat and she turned around. The marshal's office was not large. It had a front room where Hooper sat, and where a deputy named Grover sometimes lounged when he wasn't sleeping off a headache. And it had a back section with 2 cells that were currently occupied by a man sleeping off a different kind of headache. There was a bench along the wall near the door, and on that bench, half in shadow, sat a man she had not noticed when she came in. He was lean and long, the kind of lean that came from years of hard work and hard miles rather than from going without. He wore a coat the color of dust, a battered hat tipped down over his face, and boots with the kind of wear that told a story about serious distance traveled. He had dark hair going a little long at the collar, and a jaw that was strong in a way that looked like it had been tested. He might have been asleep except that when she turned toward the door, she saw his eyes were open, dark brown and very steady, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. She had not finished her account to the marshal, not really. She had stopped when it became clear it was useless, but she had not said everything. She had not mentioned that Wade Decker had come to her door himself 2 days ago, not just his cattle, not just a note. He had come at dusk and knocked, and when she had opened the door with the rifle behind her leg, he had smiled the kind of smile that made her skin crawl and told her that Thomas Merritt had borrowed money from him 6 months before he died, and that the debt was now owed to the land, and that he would have it one way or another. She had never heard of any such debt. She had gone through every paper Thomas had left and found no record of it. She believed with her full heart that Wade Decker was lying, that he was manufacturing a claim out of thin air because he wanted her acreage for the water rights that ran through the southern edge of it, and because he was the kind of man who believed a woman alone had no real means to fight him. The man on the bench was looking at her, and she had the brief, unsettling impression that he had heard every word and understood more of it than she'd said out loud. "Pardon me," she said to him, because she was going to have to walk past him to get to the door, and good manners were the last thing she still owned outright. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was quiet and a little rough, the kind of voice that had spent a lot of time outdoors. He sat forward then, elbows on his knees, and pushed his hat back on his head, and she got a better look at him. He was probably 30, maybe 32, with weather in his face but no meanness in it. He looked like a man who was thinking something through. "I heard what you told him," the man said. She stopped. "I suppose most of the street heard it." "No, I mean I heard all of it," he said, and there was something deliberate in how he said it. "What he's doing to you, the Deckers." "Then you heard the marshal's position on the matter as well," she said. "I did." He was quiet for a second, and then he said, "I'll help you." She blinked. She had not been expecting that. She had been expecting to walk out of this office and ride back to her 40 acres and figure out alone what came next. She had not been expecting a stranger on a bench to offer her anything. "You don't know what you'd be getting into," she said. "I've got a fair idea," he said. "The Deckers have 4 ranch hands and at least 2 men who work for them who aren't ranch hands, if you take my meaning." "I take it," he said. She looked at him steadily. "I don't even know your name." He stood, and she had to adjust her sense of him slightly because he was taller than she'd realized, taller and broader through the shoulders than the coat had suggested. He took off his hat and held it at his side, which was a small, old-fashioned gesture that she found herself noticing. "Nathan Prescott," he said. "I came into town this morning looking for work. Drove cattle up from Texas for the Callaway operation out of San Antonio, but they folded last spring. I've been working day work since. Fencing mostly, some carpentry." "Nathan Prescott," she repeated. "You're a cowboy." "I am," he said, "for whatever that's worth to you." She considered him for a long moment. Marshal Hooper, behind his desk, was pretending to look at papers, which was its own kind of statement about his character. Nathan Prescott stood in the thin morning light coming through the dirty window and looked at her without flinching, without the patronizing softness she'd seen in Hooper's eyes, without anything except a plain and honest attention that she found she could not dismiss. "It might be worth quite a lot," she said, "though I cannot pay you much." "I'm not asking for much," he said. "What are you asking for?" "Somewhere to sleep that isn't the livery stable," he said, and there was just the faintest trace of something dry and almost warm in it that might have been humor. "And whatever meals come with the work." She studied him for another moment. She thought about Caleb, who needed stability, who needed to see that she could handle things. She thought about the noose on the paper. She thought about Wade Decker's smile. "All right," she said. "Nathan Prescott, I'm Eudora Merritt. My property is 2 miles east along the creek road. I'll expect you before sundown." "I'll be there before noon," he said. He was. He arrived at her farm at 10:30 with everything he owned in a bedroll and a saddlebag, on a horse that was brown and plain and thoroughly dependable looking. And the first thing he did after he tied up at her fence post was walk her fence line for 2 hours without being asked, noting every cut section, every trampled post, every place where the damage had been done. When he came back to the house, he sat down at her kitchen table, which was the only real table she had, and he took a piece of paper from his coat pocket and showed her what he'd written down. 11 separate cuts, he said, all done with the same kind of tool. Wire cutters with a notched blade by the look of the ends. That's not random. That's one man doing a systematic job. She sat across from him and looked at the paper. He had drawn a rough diagram of her property line and marked each cut. She found herself leaning forward slightly because the diagram was more organized than she'd expected, the lines clean and careful. "You can read and write," she said, and then felt immediately foolish for sounding surprised. "I can," he said, without making her feel foolish at all. "My mother taught me. She was particular about it." "Mine too," Eudora said. Caleb appeared in the doorway of the back room then, sock-footed and suspicious, with his father's dark eyes and her own stubborn jaw. He was 6 years old and had been told there would be a man coming to help with the farm, and he was clearly conducting a full assessment. Nathan looked at the boy. He did not talk down to him, or make the kind of exaggerated friendly face that adults sometimes made at children, the kind that children always saw through immediately. He just nodded the same way he'd nod at any person. "You must be Caleb," he said. "Yes, sir," Caleb said. "Are you going to stay here?" "For a while, if it suits your mother." Caleb looked at Eudora. She nodded once. Caleb seemed to process this, and then he came fully into the kitchen and pulled out the chair beside Nathan and sat down and looked at the paper on the table. "What's that?" Caleb asked. "Map of your fence," Nathan said, and turned it so the boy could see it better. "Someone's been cutting it. I'm figuring out where." Caleb looked at the map with serious eyes. "I know where the worst one is," he said. "I can show you." "I'd be glad for that," Nathan said, and he meant it, which Eudora could tell and which she suspected Caleb could also tell. That afternoon Nathan repaired 7 sections of fence with wire he'd bought in town from his own money before he came out, which she did not discover until she found the receipt in the barn the next day. She did not say anything about it right away. She filed it away and thought about it. The first week was quiet in the way that she had learned to distrust. The Deckers did not come. No more notes appeared on her door. Nathan worked from sunup to past sundown, repairing the barn's back wall, reinforcing the fence completely, splitting wood for the winter stores, because she had not had time to get ahead on it. He slept in the barn on a cot he'd brought up from the tack room, which was proper and she was grateful for it, and he took his meals at the kitchen table with her and Caleb. She learned things about him in pieces, the way you learn things about someone when you worked alongside them, not through direct questions but through what surfaced naturally. He was from West Texas, from a small spread near Abilene that had belonged to his father. His father had died when Nathan was 19. Leaving more debt than land, and Nathan had gone to work as a trail hand because it was the only way he knew to earn money fast. He had done 7 cattle drives up the Kishome Trail over the following years, the last 3 with the Callaway operation. He was 31. He had never married. Why not? Caleb asked one evening at supper with the perfect, uncensored directness of a 6-year-old. Nathan looked up from his plate. He considered the question as seriously as he considered everything. "Never stayed in one place long enough," he said. "Trail work doesn't make for easy courting." "Mama had my papa," Caleb said. "He stayed." "He did," Eudora said carefully. "Your papa sounds like he was a good man," Nathan said to Caleb. "He was," Caleb said. "He could whistle real loud. Mama can't whistle at all." "That is unfortunately accurate," Eudora said, and something in the ease of saying it, in the small domestic honesty of it at a dinner table with the lamplight warm and the wind outside and the smell of her own cooking in the air, struck her as something she had been missing so deeply, and for so long that she had stopped naming the missing of it. Nathan caught her eye across the table for just a moment, and then looked back at his plate, and she thought that he understood what had just happened in that room, and that he was giving her the grace of not acknowledging it out loud. The second week, Wade Decker came. He came on a Tuesday morning when the sky was flat and gray, and the wind was cold enough to be meaningful. He came with his younger brother Roy and two of his ranch hands, all four of them on horseback, and they stopped at the fence line and called out. Eudora heard the calling from the house, and she took the rifle from above the door. Nathan was already coming out of the barn, his coat on, his hands loose at his sides. He walked to the fence and stood there, and she came to stand beside him. Wade Decker was 40 years old, broad and red-faced with small pale eyes that had the quality of being always slightly narrowed, as though everything he looked at was something he was measuring for what he could take from it. He sat his horse with the confidence of a man who had never been told no by anything that mattered. He looked at Nathan with open calculation. "Didn't know you'd hired on help, Mrs. Merritt," he said, and the Mrs. was not respectful, it was something else. "I have every right to employ help on my own land," Eudora said. "You do," Wade agreed pleasantly. "And that's the thing I wanted to discuss with you, ma'am, this matter of the land." He reached into his coat and produced papers. "I've had my attorney draw up the documentation on Thomas Merritt's debt, $240 borrowed in August of last year secured against the property." "May I see that?" Nathan said. It was not a question. Wade looked at him. "I'm speaking to Mrs. Merritt." "And she's standing right here," Nathan said. "The papers." There was a moment of the kind of stillness that had weight in it. Then Wade rode forward and held the papers out, and Nathan took them and looked at them carefully. He looked at them for a full minute, which was longer than most men would have taken. "This is dated the 14th of August, Nathan said. "Signature is Thomas Merritt's." "It is," Wade said. "What notary signed it?" Nathan asked. Wade's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "It was a private loan, didn't require notarization." In Kansas territory, a debt secured against real property requires either notarization or two witnesses whose names and addresses are on record, Nathan said. "I know this because I spent 3 years fencing and doing land work, and the men who hired me were particular about what made a document legal. This document has no notary seal and no witnesses listed. That makes it unenforceable." Roy Decker, who was 26 and had always seemed to Eudora like a man doing his best to be meaner than he naturally was because his brother expected it, shifted in his saddle. Wade's pleasant face went a degree colder. "You seem to know a great deal for a hired hand." "I know what I know," Nathan said, and he held the papers out to Wade, who took them with the controlled movement of a man who was deciding something. "This isn't finished," Wade said. "No," Nathan agreed. "But it's also not what you wanted it to be today." Wade held his gaze for a long count. Then he turned his horse and rode, and his men went with him. Roy looked back once, which Eudora noted. She and Nathan stood at the fence until they were gone. Then she let out a breath she had been holding without knowing it. "How do you know about Kansas land law?" she asked. "I told you, I've done a lot of fence and land work," Nathan said. "You learn things. Also, I spent a winter in Wichita 2 years back, and the man I roomed with was studying to be an attorney. He never stopped talking about it." "Thank God for talkative roommates," Eudora said, and she heard the relief in her own voice like a crack in something she'd been keeping very tight. Nathan smiled. It was the first full smile she'd seen from him, and it changed his face entirely, warmed it, opened something in it that the usual quiet steadiness kept closed. She found herself smiling back before she had consciously decided to. "The document might still cause problems," he said, more seriously. "Even if it's unenforceable, he could file it with a judge and create enough confusion to tie up your ownership for months. You should write to the land office in Wichita and have them confirm your deed again, in writing, and keep that letter somewhere safe." "I'll do that today," she said. "I'll help you write it if you want another set of eyes on it," he said. "I would want that," she said. That evening they sat at the kitchen table after Caleb was in bed, and they wrote the letter together. Nathan's handwriting was clear and precise, and she liked it unreasonably, the way a person likes the details of someone they are beginning to notice. They argued mildly about phrasing in a way that was not really arguing, more like two people who thought carefully, arriving at the same place from different angles. When they finished and the letter was folded and addressed, they sat for a moment in the comfortable silence that had surprised her from the first day of knowing him, the kind of silence that did not press on a person. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can," he said. "Why did you say yes? In the Marshal's office, you didn't know me. You had no reason to involve yourself." He looked at the lamp on the table for a moment. "I've ridden past a lot of situations I should have stopped for," he said. "Drove cattle through counties where I saw things happening to people who needed someone to stand still for them, and I kept moving because moving was what trail hands did. I've been thinking about that for a while." "That doesn't quite answer the question," she said gently. He looked at her then. "You were telling the truth," he said, "every word of it." And he was going to tell you there was nothing he could do, and you were going to walk out of that office and go back to your land alone, and none of what was happening to you was your fault. And I thought, he paused and seemed to choose the next words carefully, "I thought that if I kept sitting there and let you walk out that door with no one saying anything, I would be no better than Hooper." She held that for a moment. "That's a decent reason," she said. "It seemed like the only reason that made sense," he said. She looked at him in the lamplight, this quiet, careful man who had walked into her life on a Tuesday morning with everything he owned in a saddlebag, and she thought about how strange and specific the ways were that people arrived in each other's lives. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Decker isn't done." He was right. Decker was not done. 2 days after the confrontation at the fence, Eudora rode into Caldwell to mail the letter to the land office in Wichita and to buy flour and salt and a few other things she'd been putting off. She left Nathan at the farm because someone needed to be there, and she left Caleb with Nathan because the ride was not a safe one to take a child on if Decker had men watching the road, which she suspected he did. She was in Hadley's dry goods store when she overheard 2 men talking in the back near the sugar barrels. She recognized one of them as Ben Craddock, who sometimes worked for Decker, and who had the face of a man who would do whatever he was paid to do without examining it too closely. She could not hear every word, but she heard enough. Something about the barn, something about a Wednesday night when the new hand would be gone. Something about making the point without anyone getting hurt badly. She paid for her goods and rode home faster than she should have, and she told Nathan what she had heard. He listened without interrupting. Then he said, "Wednesday night, that's tomorrow." "Yes. They think I'll be gone." That was the impression I got. Nathan was quiet for a moment. He was mending a bridle at the workbench in the barn, and he set it down and rubbed the back of his neck with one hand, which was the closest thing to agitation she had seen from him. "I'm going to need to ask you something, and I need you to actually consider it and not just agree because you're angry," he said. "All right," she said. "Is there someone in town you trust? Someone you and Caleb could stay with tomorrow night, just for one night?" "You want me to leave," she said. "I want you and your son to be somewhere that isn't here if they decide making a point involves the house and not just the barn," he said. "I can watch the farm, but I'll do it better if I don't have to worry about where you are." She thought about this. She did not like it. She was not a woman who left her own property, but she thought about Caleb. "Margaret Tibbs," she said, She runs the boarding house on First Street. She's been kind to me." "Good," Nathan said. "And you," she said, "what will you do if they come?" "I'll be here," he said. It was simple and completely certain. "Nathan," she heard herself say his name and noticed it. "I'm not asking you to risk yourself for a barn." "I know you're not," he said. "I'm choosing to." She looked at him for a long moment, standing there in her barn in the fading afternoon light, and the feeling that moved through her was complicated and warm and something she did not have a clean name for yet. "Be careful," she said. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She and Caleb rode into Caldwell that Wednesday afternoon and stayed the night with Margaret Tibbs, who asked no questions and made up the spare bed with clean sheets, and gave Caleb gingerbread cookies and the dignity of being treated like a small person rather than a problem. Eudora did not sleep well. She lay in the dark and thought about Nathan on her land in the dark, waiting, and she prayed with the specific desperation of someone who was not certain they believed in prayer, but was doing it anyway. At first light she was up and on her horse before the town had fully woken, and she rode the 2 miles home in the cold gray morning with her heart in her chest like something she was carrying too carefully. The barn was standing. Nathan was sitting on the fence at the edge of the yard, drinking coffee from a tin cup like a man who had been awake all night and intended to remain calm about it. He had a bruise high on his left cheekbone that had not been there yesterday. She pulled up her horse and looked at him. "The barn is standing," she said. "It is," he said. "What happened to your face?" "Roy Decker has a harder head than he looks like," Nathan said. "Roy was here." "Roy and 2 others," Nathan said. "They came around 2 in the morning. They had a lantern." He paused. "I persuaded them to leave without using it on anything." "You persuaded 3 men with a bruise on your face," she said. "I was persuading before the bruise," he said. "The bruise is what happened when Roy got persuaded last." Something lurched in her chest. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," he said. "Drank all your coffee, though. I'll replace it." She swung down from her horse and walked to the fence and stood a few feet from him and looked at the bruise, which was purple and yellow at the edges and substantial. She reached out before she thought about it and touched the edge of it with 2 fingers lightly, and he went very still. "Sorry," she said, pulling her hand back. "Don't be," he said quietly. They looked at each other in the cold morning light with the plains stretching out behind them and the sky going from gray to pale pink above the horizon, and something shifted between them, something that had been building for days and that neither of them had named out loud yet. And Eudora thought that maybe it did not need to be named right now, that right now it could just be this standing close in the early light, this gratitude that was too large to fit inside gratitude and had to be something else. "Nathan," she said. "Eudora," he said, and the way he said her name, which most people shortened or made casual, the whole name, the proper weight of it, undid something in her. She took a step back. "I need to make breakfast," she said. "I'll unsaddle your horse," he said. They moved apart in the ordinary way of 2 people who had things to do, and neither of them said anything more about it, but the morning was different after that. Everything was different after that. She sent a formal complaint to the county sheriff's office in Wellington, 20 miles north, because Hooper was clearly useless, and she sent it with Nathan's help and with the specific legal language he knew about property harassment and the documented incident with Roy Decker. The county sheriff was a man named Aldrich who was both more competent and more interested in doing his job than Hooper, possibly because he was not in Decker's social sphere. Sheriff Aldrich came to the farm 5 days later, spoke to both Eudora and Nathan, examined the fence repairs and the documented damage, and then rode out to the Decker property. Eudora did not know what was said at that meeting, but she knew the result because Roy Decker came to her fence 3 days after that and stood at a respectful distance with his hat in his hands. Roy Decker was younger than his brother and less formed in his awfulness, which made Eudora think he might be reachable in a way Wade was not. He was broad-shouldered and fair-haired and had the look of someone who had been following someone else's lead for so long he had lost track of whether he had any of his own. "My brother told me to come," Roy said. "Is that why you're here?" Nathan said from the fence post where he was working. Roy's jaw worked. "No," he said after a minute. "I came on my own mostly." He looked at Eudora. "Ma'am, I want to apologize for what happened at your barn. That was wrong." "It was," Eudora said. "Wade's got himself a notion that the water rights through your south pasture are worth more than anything he's ever owned, and when he gets a notion like that it tends to take hold of his whole thinking," Roy said. "I went along with things I shouldn't have. The notes and the fence cutting, and he stopped. I'm sorry for it." Eudora considered him. "Your apology is noted," she said, "but what I need is for it to stop, all of it." "Yes, ma'am," Roy said. "I think it will." The county sheriff made some things very clear to Wade. "And there's a thing I maybe didn't mention to you before because Wade told me not to." He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. "That debt your husband supposedly owed. I was there when Wade wrote that document. Thomas Merritt never signed anything. Wade forged it." Eudora was very still. "I'll swear to that in writing if you need me to," Roy said. "I'll go to Wellington and say it to Sheriff Aldrich's face." "That is a very serious accusation against your own brother," Eudora said carefully. "I know it is," Roy said. "I also know it's the truth." Nathan had stopped working and was looking at Roy with the careful attention he gave to things that mattered. "Why now?" he said. "What changed?" Roy looked at the ground for a moment. "That night at the barn," he said. "The way you stood there. You could have shot me and had every right to. You didn't. You just stood there and talked to us until we had to make a decision about what kind of men we actually were." He looked up. "Made me think about it." There was a silence. Eudora looked at Roy Decker and thought about how much easier it was to do wrong things when someone else was leading you in the direction, and how hard it was to stop and turn around. And she thought that, whatever she felt about his role in everything that had happened to her, this turning around required something she was willing to give it. "Send the written statement to Sheriff Aldrich," she said. "And then consider yourself forgiven, Roy Decker. But understand that my land is my land and nothing changes that." "Yes, ma'am," Roy said and put his hat back on and rode away. She and Nathan stood looking after him. Then Nathan turned back to the fence post he'd been working on and said mildly, "That was generous." "It was practical," she said. "Holding on to it doesn't help me." "Both things can be true," he said. She thought about that. "Yes," she said, "they can." Roy Decker sent his statement to Sheriff Aldrich as promised. Wade Decker, when confronted with it and with the knowledge that his forged document was now documented as a fraud, made the calculation that most men in his position made when the legal ground shifted under them. He pulled back. He did not apologize. He did not come to Eudora's fence with his hat in his hands. He made no gesture of any kind toward reparation. But the fence cutting stopped. The notes stopped. His cattle stopped appearing in her fields. He was not finished being who he was, but his attention moved elsewhere, toward other land and other pressures and other people he could try to make smaller than himself. And Eudora's 40 acres were finally, blessedly, no longer the focus of it. The letter came back from the Wichita Land Office in early November, confirming her deed in plain and official language and providing a certified copy. She framed the certified copy and hung it on the wall of her kitchen, which Nathan noticed and said nothing about except to nod once in a particular way that conveyed exactly the right amount of satisfaction. October moved into November. The weather came in hard off the plains, the way it did in Kansas, all at once and without much warning, and the farm work shifted from the outdoor heavy work to the indoor preparation work, storing and preserving and checking every seal and seam against the coming cold. The barn was warmer than the tack room had been, and Nathan had made it more so with some board and nail work over the gaps, but Eudora found herself thinking about this more than she should have, particularly on the nights when the temperature dropped and the wind came under the door of the house, and she lay awake listening to it. She was not thinking about it from a practical standpoint, or not only. She was thinking about it because she had begun to be aware of Nathan Prescott in the way that you became aware of a sound you had first registered as background, and then gradually could not stop hearing. She noticed where he was in a room. She noticed when he was late coming in for supper, and felt the particular quality of relief when she heard his boots on the step. She noticed his hands, which were large and careful and which fixed things well. She noticed his voice, which was quiet in a way that made her lean in slightly when he talked, not because he was hard to hear but because she wanted to be closer to it. She had been a widow for 10 months. She had loved Thomas Merritt, had loved him sincerely and well and mourned him genuinely. And none of that was diminished by the fact that standing in her own kitchen watching Nathan Prescott explain something to her son with patient, careful words made something in her chest ache with a wanting she had not allowed herself to have in a long time. She did not do anything with this awareness except carry it carefully and examine it privately and tell herself, reasonably, that she should not make assumptions about what he felt. Nathan, for his part, gave her no reason to assume anything, which was both respectful and quietly maddening. He was steady and present and helpful. He made Caleb a small wooden horse one evening, carved from a scrap of pine, with a patience and skill that made Caleb go quiet with delight. He remembered how she took her coffee and had it made before she got to the kitchen on the mornings. He rose earlier than she did. He read to Caleb from the small collection of books she had, one of which was a damaged copy of Ivanhoe, reading with expression and occasional commentary that made Caleb howl with laughter, and the sound of her son laughing with Nathan in the next room while she put away dishes was the closest thing to happiness she had felt in nearly a year. But he did not step across any line. He was always exactly appropriate. He was a man who had understood, without being told, all the things that needed to be understood about her situation and her dignity, and what she could afford to risk. It was Caleb who broke it open, because 6-year-olds had a talent for cutting directly to the truth of things. It was a Sunday afternoon in mid-November, cold and still outside, and they were all three in the kitchen, Caleb doing the letter practice Eudora had set him, and Nathan mending a split in his saddle. And the light was the low golden light of a winter afternoon, and everything was quiet and warm. Caleb looked up from his letters and looked at Nathan and then at Eudora with the directness of a small person who had been thinking about something for a while. "Are you going to stay here?" he asked Nathan. Nathan looked up from the saddle. "What's that?" "When the Decker problem is finished," Caleb said. "Are you going to stay here or are you going to go somewhere else?" Nathan was quiet for a moment. Eudora found herself very interested in the window. "I don't know yet," Nathan said carefully. "I want you to stay," Caleb said, with the simplicity of someone who had not yet learned to protect themselves from wanting things out loud. "You're good at fixing things and you read good and Mama doesn't cry at night as much when you're here." Eudora closed her eyes. "Caleb," she said. "Well, it's true," Caleb said, in the tone of a child who understood that he had said something significant and was not sure yet whether it was the right thing or not. She looked at Nathan, because she had no choice now but to look at him, and he was looking at her with something in his face she had not seen before, something open and careful at the same time. "Excuse me," she said, and she went out to the back step, which was cold, and she stood there and breathed the cold air and stared at the frozen grass and felt her face burning. She heard the door behind her after a minute and she did not turn around. "He didn't mean to embarrass you," Nathan said from behind her. "He was telling the truth," she said. "I know," Nathan said. She turned around then. He was standing in the doorway with the warm light of the kitchen behind him, his hat in his hands in that way he had. "I don't know what to do with what I feel," she said, because apparently honesty was what the afternoon was going to require of her. "I'm a widow with a child and 40 acres and a history with this county that isn't simple, and you're a man who came here to help me and I have no way of knowing whether." She stopped. "Whether what?" he said quietly. "Whether what I feel is real or whether it's gratitude dressed up as something else," she said. Nathan was quiet for a moment. He looked at the hat in his hands and then at her. "Can I tell you something?" he said. "Please," she said. "I have stayed in a lot of places," he said. "Ranches and trail camps and boarding houses and bunkhouses from San Antonio to Abilene to Wichita. I have never once in all of it felt like I was somewhere I was supposed to be." Not until I rode up to this fence line 3 weeks ago. He paused. I don't think that's circumstance. I think that's something I would like your permission to say out loud. She looked at him, this quiet and serious man who had said yes to her in a marshal's office when the easiest thing in the world would have been to keep sitting on that bench. And she thought that whatever the thing was between them, gratitude or something larger, it had arrived with the full weight of something true. I think I can give you that permission, she said. He took one step forward and then he stopped, because he was the kind of man who asked rather than assumed, and he held out his hand. She looked at it and then she put her hand in his, and he held it with the same careful steadiness he brought to everything, and they stood on the cold back step in the November light, and that was enough. That was all of it, all the beginning of something that they both understood was going to matter for a long time. Caleb appeared in the doorway and looked at them with satisfaction. Good, he said, and went back inside to his letters. Nathan laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him, and Eudora laughed too, and the sound of it in the cold air was the best thing she had heard in a very long time. The weeks that followed were different in the particular way that things are different when something has been named. Nothing dramatic changed. The work was the same. The mornings were the same, but there was a new quality to all of it, a warmth underneath the ordinary, a current running through the days that made everything feel more alive. Nathan began courting her in the old-fashioned, careful way which suited both of them. He brought her a wildflower he found growing improbably along the creek in late November, a single small purple thing that she pressed between the pages of a book and kept. He walked with her in the evenings after Caleb was in bed, the two of them going as far as the creek and back, talking about everything and nothing, their breath making clouds in the cold air. He asked about Thomas, and she told him, and he listened to all of it without jealousy or discomfort, understanding, she thought, that a woman's history was not a threat but a part of who she was. She asked about his life on the trail, about the drives and the country he'd seen, and the people he'd known, and he told her things she had the sense he'd never told anyone, small specific things. The way the Texas sky looked at 4 in the morning before a drive day. The way a river crossing felt when the cattle went quiet in the water. He had a poet's attention to detail without any of the performance, and she found herself thinking that he had been carrying these observations around for years with no one particular to give them to. She gave them a home. In December, Nathan rode into Caldwell and came back with a small length of ribbon from the dry goods store, blue, the color of a clear day sky, and he gave it to her without ceremony, just held it out and said he'd seen it and thought of her. And she took it and tied it in her hair right then, and his eyes did the thing they did sometimes, going warm in a way that he didn't try to hide from her anymore. They were in the kitchen one evening 2 weeks before Christmas when he said, I want to ask you something and I want you to answer honestly and not on account of anything practical. She set down the cup she was holding. All right, she said. If I were to file for my own land claim, he said, there's 40 acres adjacent to yours to the north that's been sitting unregistered since the previous holder abandoned it last spring. I looked into it. It's available. It would put my land bordering yours and I'd be a neighbor in the proper sense. He paused. I'm not asking because it makes practical sense with your situation, though it does. I'm asking because I want roots somewhere. I want this to be where they go. She looked at him across the table. That is a question that has an obvious implication in it, she said. It does, he said. I'm not hiding that. I want to be here. I want to stay. I want to do that properly with time and whatever you need, but I want to start it with ground under my feet that's mine. She felt the specific quality of being known, of being understood by someone who had taken the time to understand her, and it was the most complete feeling she had experienced in a long time. File for the land, she said, and then court me properly, Nathan Prescott. Yes, ma'am, he said and smiled, and she felt it all the way through. Christmas of 1882 was the best one Eudora could remember since before the hard years had started. She made a proper Christmas dinner with a chicken from her own yard, and dried apple pie and sweet potatoes and biscuits. Nathan had gotten Caleb a pocket knife with a bone handle, age-appropriate and useful, and exactly right for a 6-year-old boy who wanted to feel capable. And Caleb had been so overcome by it that he had hugged Nathan spontaneously and then looked embarrassed about it. And Nathan had hugged him back without making a production of it. And Eudora had had to find something to look at across the room because of what was happening behind her eyes. Nathan had gotten her a book. Not a practical book, not a farming almanac or a household manual, but a novel, one she had mentioned once in passing, in a story he had clearly been paying attention to, and it had a cloth cover and clean pages, and it was the most thoughtful gift she had received in years. She had gotten him a new pair of leather gloves, fitted, because his old ones had holes worn through the palms, and a small compass, because she had found a worn one in his coat pocket, and she thought about a man who had spent 10 years navigating and always needed to know where north was. She had thought very carefully about the compass. He held it for a long moment and looked at it and then looked at her and said, "I know where I am now." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. Spring came early in 1883, the way it sometimes did in Kansas, with a rush of warm air and the smell of the turned earth that was the best smell in the world to anyone who farmed it. Nathan filed his land claim in February, and the 40 acres to the north became his by legal right of the Homestead Act, and he immediately set to work on the south edge of it, building a proper structure. He built a house. He built it with his own hands, with help from Eudora when she could spare the time and from Caleb when the boy wasn't in the kitchen school lessons she ran most mornings. It was not a large house. It had a main room and a kitchen and 2 bedrooms and a proper floor, not packed earth, and a porch that faced west to catch the evening light. He built it, and then one evening in April when the last board was up and the last nail was in, he came to her kitchen door and knocked, which he never did anymore because he had long since been simply welcome. She opened the door. He was cleaned up and his hat was in his hands, and he looked at her with the steadiness that she had come to understand was not distance but the opposite of it, the way a very deep thing could look still on the surface. "Eudora," he said. "Nathan," she said. "I have a house," he said. "I have land and a house, and he paused. "I have had 11 months of watching you be the most capable and honest and strong and kind person I have ever had the privilege of knowing, and I have something to ask you." She could feel her heart in her chest. "I would like for you to marry me," he said. "Not because it makes practical sense, though it does, and not because of the land, though I want the land to be ours together. Because you are who you are, and because I cannot imagine a future that doesn't have you in it, and because I want to be the kind of man who deserves to stand next to you for the rest of my life." She stood in her doorway and looked at this man she had watched work and think and laugh and care, this man who had said yes when he didn't have to, this man who had stood between her and a lantern in the dark and held her hand on a cold November step and listened to every word she'd ever said to him like it mattered. "Yes," she said. "Nathan Prescott, yes." He exhaled, and she saw the relief in it, that he had been genuinely uncertain, that he had not taken her answer for granted, and she loved that about him too. They were married in the spring of 1883, on a Saturday in May when the prairie was as green as it got, and the sky was the particular shade of blue that had no name except Kansas in May. The ceremony was held at the small Methodist church on the edge of Caldwell, performed by Reverend Marshal, who was a dry and economical man who nonetheless managed to make the words feel like they meant something. Margaret Tibbs was there, who had been kind from the beginning. Old Hadley from the dry goods store came, and a few of the farm families from the neighboring land, people who had watched Eudora hold her ground through the winter, and had come to have a particular respect for her because of it. Caleb stood beside Nathan during the ceremony with the solemnity of a boy who understood that this was a serious occasion and that his job in it was important. He was wearing a shirt that Eudora had pressed that morning, and his hair was combed. And he looked up at Nathan at one point during the vows, with an expression of such uncomplicated certainty that Reverend Marsh actually paused for a moment. When the Reverend said Nathan might kiss his bride, Nathan turned to Eudora and touched her face with one hand, gently, the way he touched things he was careful with, and kissed her with the restrained tenderness of a man who had a great deal more feeling in him than he usually showed the world. And she thought that she had chosen very well, or that something larger than choice had arranged it, and either way she was grateful. Roy Decker, of all people, stopped by the church steps afterward, not to join the celebration but to take off his hat and offer his hand to Nathan and say something quiet that Eudora was not close enough to hear. Nathan shook his hand and said something back. Roy nodded and put his hat on and walked away. She asked Nathan later what had been said. "He said he hoped we'd be happy," Nathan said, "and I told him we intended to be." Wade Decker, mercifully, was nowhere to be seen. He had moved his operation north by rumor, and his presence in Caldwell had become infrequent and irrelevant to her life. She did not wish him harm. She also did not think about him very much anymore, which was its own kind of victory. The first summer of their marriage was a working one and a happy one. They farmed the combined acreage together, making decisions about what to plant and where as partners in the full sense, each bringing their own knowledge and neither overriding the other. Nathan had a particular skill with horses that translated usefully into the horse trading that was a necessary part of frontier economics, and he began buying and training and selling horses on a modest scale that brought in steady money on top of the farming income. Caleb attached himself to Nathan with the wholehearted love that children had for people who showed up steadily and honestly, and Nathan received it with the same steadiness he brought to everything, giving Caleb not only his time and attention, but the specific kind of man-to-boy guidance that Caleb had been missing, and that no one had been able to give him before. They rode together in the evenings, Nathan teaching Caleb the proper care of horses, and Eudora sometimes stood at the window and watched them in the long summer light, and felt the specific fullness of a life that had been built out of difficulty, and was now something real and good. Marshal Hooper retired that September, largely because Sheriff Aldrich in Wellington had made it very clear that his performance of the previous year had not gone unnoticed at the county level. His replacement was a younger man named Collins who had an actual interest in doing the job, and Caldwell was marginally better for it. In November, Eudora discovered she was expecting their first child. She told Nathan on a quiet evening when Caleb was in bed and the fire was low and they were sitting close together in the way they had fallen into, her shoulder against his arm. She said simply, "We're going to have a baby." Nathan was very still for a moment. Then he set down the piece of harness he'd been working on and turned to her and looked at her with something in his face she would remember for the rest of her life, something so unguarded and so full that it made her throat tight. "Are you well?" he asked first, because that was the kind of man he was. "I'm well," she said. "Very well." He pulled her close then, his arm around her, his cheek against her hair, and he held her with a careful, complete warmth that said everything he did not have words for at that moment. "A baby," he said quietly, like he was trying the reality of it on. "A baby," she confirmed. "Caleb's going to have a lot of opinions about this," he said, and she could hear the smile in it. "He absolutely is," she said. "Good," Nathan said. "That means he feels safe enough to have opinions." She turned her face into his shoulder and held on. "You're going to be a wonderful father," she said. "I'm going to work hard at it," he said. "That's what I can promise." "That's exactly enough," she said. The winter of 1883 to 1884 was a hard one on the Kansas plains. The cold came in January with a particular ferocity that froze the water trough solid every night and made the cattle lean and the horses restless. Eudora was large with the baby and moved more carefully, and Nathan was attentive without hovering, which was its own skill, anticipating what she needed without treating her as though the pregnancy had made her incapable. Caleb, informed of the coming sibling in November, had initially been uncertain about the whole enterprise. He was 7 years old and had had his mother's full attention for his entire life, and was not entirely certain he wanted to share it. But Nathan had talked to him about it man to man, about what it meant to be an older brother, and how Caleb would be a person this new baby would look up to from the very beginning. And Caleb had taken this information seriously and had come around, gradually, to a cautious enthusiasm. The baby was born on a Tuesday morning in late March 1884, when the first edges of spring were just beginning to show in the color of the sky. It was a healthy boy, loud and red-faced and specific-looking, with Nathan's dark hair and Eudora's eyes. They named him James Thomas Prescott, the Thomas for the man who had farmed this land first and loved Eudora first and given Caleb his dark eyes, because Nathan had proposed it, and because she had understood immediately that it was the right thing, that Nathan understood that a woman's whole history deserved to be honored, not erased. Caleb met James with the gravity of a 7-year-old who had been told he was going to be important to this person. He looked at the red-faced, blinking infant for a long time and then said, "He's very small." "He is," Nathan said. "He'll get bigger." "Will he be able to help with horses?" Caleb asked. "In a few years," Nathan said. Caleb considered this. "All right," he said. He looked at James again. "I'll teach him things." "I know you will," Nathan said. Eudora watched them, her husband and her 2 sons, in the morning light of the bedroom, and she thought about the Marshal's office in the early autumn of 1882, about the door she had been ready to walk out alone, about the man who had stood up from a bench and said yes before she'd even finished explaining what she needed. And she thought that the world had arranged itself in a way she could not have predicted and could not have planned and could not have earned exactly, but had arrived at anyway, through persistence and stubbornness and a certain amount of grace. The spring of 1884 was abundant. The farm yielded well, the horses Nathan bought at the winter auction sold at good prices, and the 40 acres that had been hers alone were now part of a proper working operation, the 2 land claims filed together under their names, Eudora and Nathan Prescott, on a deed that hung beside the other framed document in their kitchen. They built a proper henhouse. Nathan put a new porch on the farmhouse. Caleb learned to ride with the kind of confidence that would have made any trail hand proud, sitting a horse with a natural ease that Nathan said was something you couldn't teach. You either had it or you didn't, and Caleb definitely had it. James grew from a loud, red-faced infant into a loud, active baby who demanded attention with the cheerful relentlessness of a second child, who had learned early that older siblings could be leveraged. He smiled at 7 weeks and laughed at 4 months, and Nathan, who had been a reserved and quiet man in the years before this life, turned out to be the kind of father who made ridiculous faces to produce that laugh, and was not the least bit embarrassed about it. Margaret Tibbs came out from town sometimes on Sundays for supper, and she and Eudora sat on the porch while Nathan and Caleb worked with the horses in the paddock, and Margaret said on one of those afternoons, "I remember you coming to my house with your son on a November night looking like a woman carrying the whole world by herself." "I was," Eudora said. "And look at this," Margaret said, gesturing at the paddock, at the house, at the whole solid, alive thing of it. "I know," Eudora said. "Do you know how rare that is?" Margaret said. "What you have here, not just the land but the whole of it, the way that man looks at you." Eudora looked at Nathan, who was showing Caleb something about a horse's left front hoof. Both of them crouched down and focused, and she thought about what Margaret was saying, and she knew it was true, and she held it with the deliberate appreciation of someone who understood what its absence felt like. "I know," she said again. By the summer of 1884, Caldwell itself had changed in the way that frontier towns changed, constantly and without sentiment. The cattle drives that had been its lifeblood were slowing as the railroads moved south and changed the routes, and the wild, loud quality of the town was giving way to something more settled, more ordinary in both good and difficult ways. Businesses opened and closed. Families arrived and families left. The school that had been proposed for years was finally being built on the west side of town, a proper wooden schoolhouse with 2 rooms and a bell. Caleb would start there in September. He was 7 now, sharp and quick and ready for it, and the knowledge that he would have proper schooling rather than only what Eudora could provide at the kitchen table was a satisfaction she felt deeply. She and Nathan rode into town for the school board meeting in August, where parents and town members discussed the terms of the school and the hiring of a teacher. Eudora spoke at the meeting, clearly and with specifics, about what the curriculum should include, about the importance of teaching both reading and figures to the same standard for every child, and she said it in a room where not everyone agreed with her, and she said it anyway. Nathan, sitting beside her, said nothing during her remarks, which was exactly right. He was there as her husband and her partner, not her voice. Afterward, walking back to where they'd tied the horses, he said, "You're good at that." "At what?" she said. "Speaking in a room where people don't necessarily want to hear you," he said. "You do it without apology." "I had good practice," she said. "Decker," he said. "And every person who told me to sell the land, and every person who looked at a widow with a child and decided she wasn't worth taking seriously," she said. "They were useful in the end. They taught me how to stand still under it." "They should have known better," Nathan said. "Yes," she said. "But since they didn't, I made use of it." He took her hand as they walked, a thing he did naturally and without ceremony, and she thought that the specific, quiet comfort of a hand in hers that she trusted completely was one of the great underrated goods of a life. James took his first steps on a September afternoon when Eudora was hanging washing, and Nathan was in the paddock, and Caleb, just home from his first week of school, was sitting on the kitchen floor watching his baby brother. The first anyone else knew of it was Caleb's yell, the specific triumphant yell of a 7-year-old boy witnessing an event of significance. Eudora and Nathan came from opposite directions and arrived at the kitchen door at the same moment, and James was standing in the middle of the kitchen floor with the unsteady, delighted expression of someone who had just discovered something wonderful about himself. And he looked at his parents with the pure pride of a person whose world had just gotten larger. Nathan picked him up and held him above his head, which made James shriek with laughter, and Caleb stood in the middle of the kitchen looking proud and proprietary about the whole thing, as though he had personally taught his brother to walk. "He did it twice," Caleb said. "2 whole steps." "That's 2 more than he could do this morning," Nathan said, bringing James back down to his chest where the baby grabbed his collar with both fists. "He'll be running by Christmas," Eudora said. "God help us," Nathan said, but with the particular warmth that made even the mock complaint something loving. In October, on the evening of their first wedding anniversary, Nathan took Eudora on a walk to the western edge of their combined land, to the hill that caught the best of the sunset, a gentle rise in the prairie that had a view across the flat country all the way to where the sky came down. It was cold and the stars were coming out, and she was wrapped in her good coat, and he stood beside her, and they watched the last of the light go from orange to purple to the deep blue of a Kansas evening, and she thought about where she had been a year ago exactly, standing on the church steps in her best dress with Caleb beside her and Margaret throwing dried flower petals and Nathan looking at her with that open, unguarded thing in his face. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "About the Marshal's office," she said. He laughed softly. "Good memory. I walked in there scared to death," she said. "I had practiced what to say. I had my voice under control. I had thought through everything I was going to say, and I still knew, walking in, that it wasn't going to work, that he wasn't going to help me, and I said it anyway because what else was there to do? And then you turned around and there was a man on a bench," Nathan said. "There was a man on a bench," she said, looking at me like he was about to make a decision. "I was," he said. "What would you have done if I'd walked out before you said anything?" she asked. "Would you have come after me?" He was quiet for a moment, honestly considering it. "Yes," he said. "I think I would have. I think I would have followed you outside and introduced myself on the street and said the same thing." You don't know that, she said. I know that I know the difference between a moment where I'm supposed to move and one where I'm not, he said. That was a moment where I was supposed to move. She leaned into his side and he put his arm around her and they stood on the hill in the first dark of their anniversary evening, and the stars above the Kansas plains were the same stars they had always been, enormous and indifferent and somehow, in the right company, deeply comforting. I'm glad you moved, she said. So am I, he said. He kissed her there on the hill, with the wind coming cold across the grass and the last light gone and the stars very clear, and she held on to him and thought that love was a strange and specific thing, arriving through unlikely doors in the least expected ways, and that the best you could do was to be present enough to recognize it when it stood up from a bench and offered itself to you. In the winter of 1885, Eudora discovered she was expecting again. She told Nathan in the same quiet way as the first time, in the evening by the fire, and he had the same stillness and the same unguarded face and the same first question about whether she was well. Very well, she said. Both times. Good, he said, both times. Nathan, she said. Yes. Are you happy, she asked. Not are we managing, not is the farm good, not is the work going well. Are you happy? He looked at her in the firelight, this man who had spent 10 years moving and had finally stopped, and he said, I am the happiest I have ever been, by a great distance. She took his hand. Good, she said. Me too. Caleb was growing into a remarkable boy, sharp-tongued and funny and serious by turns, with Nathan's patience when he chose to use it, and Eudora's stubborn precision when something mattered to him. At school he was doing well, the teacher Miss Hartwell writing in her first assessment that Caleb had an unusual combination of mathematical ability and verbal quickness. He was also, Miss Hartwell noted, protective of the smaller children in a way she found admirable, which made both Nathan and Eudora look at each other across the dinner table with the private parental satisfaction of people who knew what that protectiveness came from. James was by this time a walking, running, climbing, extremely opinionated small person of 1 year and some months who had a personality that was his own from the beginning, loud and joyful and specific. He had attached himself to the horses with the same deep fascination Caleb had, but where Caleb's was methodical and technical, James's was purely emotional. He loved them the way small children love large animals that they do not yet understand could harm them, with a complete and trusting abandon. Nathan was always there between James and the horses until the trust was earned, and the knowledge was real, patient and watchful without being restrictive, letting the boy learn what he needed to learn at the pace that was safe. This was, Eudora thought, the core of what she loved most about Nathan Prescott. Not the way he had stood between her and the Deckers, though that had mattered enormously. Not the competence or the steadiness or even the quiet intelligence that she still found surprising and delightful. It was the patience, the willingness to let things develop at their own proper rate, to give things the time they needed, to trust that the right outcome was possible if you did the work and waited honestly. He had done that with her. He had been patient with her grief and her wariness and her practicality and her pride, had given her the time and the space to arrive at what she felt without pressure or performance, and she had arrived there fully and freely, which meant it was real in a way it might not have been otherwise. The second child was born in June of 1885, a girl this time, with red in her hair that neither Nathan nor Eudora could account for, and a voice that filled the room from the first minute. They named her Clara Ruth Prescott, and Caleb, who was 8 and had adjusted excellently to the concept of siblings, held her with the careful solemnity of someone who understood that small things were serious responsibilities. She's louder than James was, Caleb said. She is, Nathan agreed. Is that normal? Everyone is different, Eudora said, from the bed where she was resting, feeling the specific exhaustion and specific completeness of a woman who has done something enormous and survived it well. She's going to be trouble, Caleb said, with the authority of a boy who had younger siblings and was forming theories about them. Nathan looked at Clara, who had gone quiet in his arms and was looking at him with the dark-eyed, unfocused attention of a newborn trying to make sense of the world. "She's going to be wonderful," he said. And she was. Clara Ruth Prescott was, from her very earliest days, a person of strong opinions and strong feelings, and a charm that was so direct and unself-conscious that no one ever quite managed to refuse her. She smiled early and talked early, and had an opinion about everything from the temperature of her milk to the arrangement of her blankets, and she expressed these opinions with a clarity that made her parents laugh helplessly, and her brothers alternately adore and despair of her. The farm in 1886 was a proper going concern. Nathan had expanded the horse trading operation to include a small selective breeding program, working with 2 other families in the county to improve their stock, and the income from it supplemented the farming reliably enough that they had been able to build a proper root cellar and enlarge the kitchen and put glass in all the windows of the house. The Caldwell Livestock Exchange, established the previous year, bought from Nathan regularly, and he had built a reputation in the county as a man who dealt honestly and knew horses. Eudora had her land certified clear of any encumbrances by the county register, which meant the combined Prescott property was as secure in law as it was possible to be. The deed with both their names on it hung in the kitchen, beside the framed certification of her original claim, and she looked at both of them sometimes in the morning when the light came through the new glass window, and felt the solid, real weight of having built something that would last. Margaret Tibbs married a widower from Wichita in the spring of 1886 and moved north, which made Eudora genuinely sad, but they wrote letters regularly, and Margaret came back to visit twice a year, and the friendship was one of those durable things that distance made more appreciated rather than less. Roy Decker had done what he said he would and filed his statement with Sheriff Aldrich, and Wade Decker had faced a fraud hearing that year, the result of which was a substantial fine and a formal county record of the fraudulent document. Wade Decker had paid the fine with the kind of tight-jawed pride of a man who would never admit he had been wrong, and he had moved his operation out of Sumner County entirely the following spring. His presence in their lives had shrunk to nothing, and Eudora was content to leave it that way. On a warm October evening in 1886, 3 years after they had married on the steps of the Methodist Church, Nathan and Eudora sat on the porch of their farmhouse while the children were inside. Caleb was 9 and reading by himself. James was 2 and presumably asleep. Clara Ruth was 1 and definitely asleep. The sunset was the kind that Kansans knew as a late fall gift, all gold and deep orange laid flat across the horizon, the sky above it going the dark, transparent blue that you could almost see through to what was on the other side. "Tell me something," Eudora said. "What do you want to know?" Nathan said. "Something you've never told anyone else," she said. "Something small." He was quiet for a moment, thinking. "When I was 15, he said, "I found an injured hawk on our property. One wing was broken. I splinted it with 2 sticks and a strip from my shirt and kept it in a box in the barn for 6 weeks until it healed. Fed it mice I caught in the grain store." "Did it fly?" she asked. "It did," he said. "I let it go from the top of the fence at the east pasture and it went straight up and turned south and was gone in about 30 seconds. "Was that hard?" she said. "Letting it go?" "Yes," he said, "and good both at once." He looked at her. "Some things are supposed to go and some things are supposed to stay." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "And which one am I?" she said. "You're the staying kind," he said. "Absolutely, completely, without any question at all." She closed her eyes and listened to the evening sounds, the horses in the paddock, the faint voice of Caleb inside reading something out loud to himself the way he did, the wind moving through the dry grass of the late-year plains, and the solid, warm presence of Nathan beside her, his arm around her, the whole weight of their shared life in the warm and ordinary quality of the moment. She thought about everything it had taken to get here. The grief of losing Thomas, which had been real and had been survived. The fear of that first winter alone, the cut fences and the notes with knives through them. The morning she had walked into the marshal's office with dried mud on her boots and the carefully prepared words ready in her mouth, and the absolute knowledge that help was not guaranteed, had never been guaranteed, had to be asked for in a world that did not automatically offer it. And the man on the bench who had stood up. She had not finished telling Hooper everything when Nathan had said yes. She had stopped when it was clear it was useless, had not yet gotten to the most frightening parts. And still he had said yes, this quiet, serious man with honest eyes who had been sitting in a marshal's office looking for work, and had stood up from that bench and said yes before she'd finished and had not regretted it for a single day. She had not regretted opening her door to him either, which was its own kind of yes. "Nathan," she said. He said. "I'm glad you were on that bench." She felt the movement of him laughing softly, the small physical expression of it moving through his chest where her head rested. "I'm glad you walked in," he said. The stars were coming out over the Kansas plains, the first ones in the darkening east, and the horses were quiet in the paddock. And in the house behind them, their children were alive and safe and growing. And the land that had cost everything was theirs and was good. And the man beside her was the one she would wake beside tomorrow and the day after that. And there was no part of the life they had built together that she would trade or reduce or reconsider. The night settled over them, warm with the last of the autumn day's heat, and they stayed on the porch in the easy silence that belonged only to people who knew each other completely, and had learned to rest in that knowing. The two of them together on the edge of the prairie in the long, full quiet of everything that had been survived and everything that had been built and everything that was still, wonderfully, to come.